So this is the big one, homosexuality. Everybody, Mormons and evangelical Christians specifically, want to say the Bible condemns homosexuality in the Old and New Testament. Closed story. It's evil, bad behavior. Don't do it. And
that's wrong for a number of different reasons. And the first one is a kind of semantic issue. People say homosexuality, but the Bible technically does not address homosexuality anywhere. There's not a single syllable of the Bible that addresses homosexuality as we use the word today, which is a reference to a sexual orientation. So that is to say, when we talk about homosexuality, we're talking about the notion that someone can be oriented towards attraction, sexual attraction to members of their same sex. That concept is totally alien to the Bible because that idea of sexual orientation began developing in the 19th century. Anciently, they did not have the concept of someone being oriented towards sexual attraction to their own sex as a kind of immutable internal aspect of their psychology.
Yeah, not to interrupt, but I'm reading just through Google that Carl Maria Kurtbeny coined the word homosexual in an 1868 letter. So, I mean, before some, I don't know, German psychologist came up with the term, society didn't even have a word to describe what people want to say the Bible forbade 2 to 4 millennia before that word even existed, right?
Right. And that's describing something that's a lot broader and a lot more generic than what's being addressed in the Bible. Because once you talk about homosexuality, you're talking about just that sexual orientation, which means someone who may never once engage in same-sex intercourse would be condemned if we talk about the Bible addressing homosexuality. But the Bible never addresses just the notion of someone who is oriented towards sexual attraction to the same sex. Totally absent from the Bible. So that is inaccurate to talk about the Bible addressing homosexuality. The Bible does address acts of same-sex intercourse, and overwhelming, when it does bring them up, it is condemnatory of acts of same-sex intercourse. However, the way the Bible addresses that where it does needs to be properly contextualized because the references are quite limited and also they're motivated by rationales that are totally irrelevant, completely outdated, have absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the way the world works today.
And kind of they're kind of modern ideas imposed on the ancient text. Is that right?
Yeah, because they thought and talked about sex in completely different ways anciently. For instance, one of the ways is they did not think of sex as something that 2 equal parties engaged in mutually and consensually. Sex was something that one person did to another, and specifically what a man did to a woman. The man was the main agent. The woman's agency was less important if it was relevant at all. She was the object of the sexual act. She was not the subject of the sexual act. And so there was a socially conventionalized hierarchy of domination and of penetration that kind of arranged the way people thought and talked about sex.
That's how in the animal kingdom copulation happens.
Yeah.
And so if ancient early humans thought of sex as something the male does to the female, that would make perfect sense to me.
Yeah, and when you look in the Bible, you see references to men taking women, and they use a variety of different verbs to refer to that. But the agency of the woman is almost never a concern. Now we have David.
Women are they're property, right?
For the most part, yeah, they're treated as property. It's not 100% property. I would say there's a spectrum. And they're operating between personhood and property. Sex was about a role that people played within society, and men were higher up on that hierarchy of domination and penetration. And so for a man to take a submissive role in sexual intercourse was considered to be debasing. And so anciently, and we see this going from 1000 BCE all the way down to about 1000 CE, we see examples of this idea that it was inappropriate for a man to be on the bottom during sex, even with his own wife, because that was taking a submissive role in a sexual act, and to do so was inappropriate for someone who occupied the pinnacle of that hierarchy of domination. And so we have ancient Mesopotamian, what are called sex omens, that talk about how if a man is on the bottom during sex with his wife, he will, the text says, lose his personal God. Basically, she robs him of his vitality, and for a month, he is vitalityless. He's basically has lost his vigor. We see something similar there's a Talmudic text that says if a man is on the bottom during sex with his wife, he will be stricken with diarrhea. And we have the alphabet of Ben Sira, which is this famous text that's riffing on the Garden of Eden, which is where we get the idea that Lilith was Adam's first wife, where Lilith abandons the Garden of Eden because the text says she wanted to be on top. And Adam says, you're not fit to be on top, only I am fit to be on top.
And this is referring to sexual position?
Yes.
Not like metaphorical power structure?
Ultimately, that's what it's pointing in the direction of, that the sexual position is a reflection of social roles. But so she storms out and goes off, and God sends 3 angels after her, and she doesn't want to come back. And I've talked about that in a number of other places in the past. But ultimately, for the course of 2,000 years, and we've seen it in other places as well, for a man to be on the bottom was a violation of his social status. And so similarly, for a man to take a submissive position in a sexual act with another man was even more debasing, because now not only was he taking a submissive position, but was actually taking the receptive role rather than the insertive role. And so it's kind of doubling up the debasing and the lowering of himself on that hierarchy of domination and penetration. So when we see...
In other words, homosexuality would be wrong because the man that was on the bottom would be lowering himself to be the status of a woman.
Right.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, more or less.
Which is super sexist.
Yeah. And there were a handful of ways that this is addressed in the laws of other nations. For the most part, it was kind of, it was there, and they didn't have too much of an issue with it. But when it is addressed, it seems what we see is this idea that it would be natural for a man to want to take the insertive role with pretty much anything. Like if you're walking around with a hammer, you're looking for nails, basically. So it is understandable that a man would want to take the insertive role with someone who may not be a woman. So there were ways that they rationalized why men might engage in same-sex intercourse, taking the insertive role. A man seeking out the receptive role, however, was not easily rationalized. That didn't make any sense to them. And so that was something that was pathologized. Someone who sought out the receptive role had something seriously wrong with them.
It's like, why would you give up power and status?
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah. And so it indicates there's something wrong with this person. And they weren't asked the question, but if you ask them, why do you think people seek out the receptive role in an act of male same-sex intercourse? They probably wouldn't have a good answer for you. Just say something's wrong with them. And when we get into Greco-Roman period Judaism, they refer to it, at least Philo does, as the feminizing disease. So this is a completely different explanation for why someone might seek out that role. They didn't really have a concept of the versatile role. So there was not an understanding that two men of the same social status, of roughly the same age, could engage in mutual, versatile same-sex intercourse. That just did not compute for them. So when we have Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13 addressing male same-sex intercourse, they're limited to male same-sex intercourse. They don't mention female same-sex intercourse at all, and that is conspicuous. Because immediately after those verses in both chapters, they go on to say, oh yeah, you can't have sex with animals, and also women can't either. So they make sure to include the women in the very next verse. They totally ignore the women when they're talking about same-sex intercourse. So this has something to do with the fact that a male plays a specific role in sexual acts. But in
other words, Old Testament isn't prohibiting lesbianism at all.
There's no reference to it anywhere in the Old Testament.
So Christians who want to denounce homosexuality, that's a problem.
Well, that...
at least from the Old Testament.
From the Hebrew Bible, there's no reference to it whatsoever. There's one reference to it in the New Testament.
Okay, we'll get there.
We'll get there.
Okay.
So Leviticus 18:22 prohibits a man from engaging in an act of same-sex intercourse with another man, but it seems to only be prohibiting the man taking the insertive role. In Leviticus 20:13, it talks about a man taking the insertive role, but then it says that they both are subjected to the death penalty. They both have to die. And Leviticus 20 is repeating pretty much everything that's mentioned in Leviticus 18, but is imposing penalties. Whereas Leviticus 18 is only prohibiting it, Leviticus 20 is saying, you got to die, you got to die, you got to die, you got to die. But it expands the responsible parties, and most of Leviticus 18 is talking about prohibited sex between men and relatives. And when you get to Leviticus 20, they both die. And the woman's agency is not a concern in either of these chapters. So it's not saying both parties are equally responsible for engaging mutually and consensually in this sinful act. The idea here is that this sinful act produces kind of a metaphysical contaminant that pollutes the land, and the land is going to literally vomit you out if it reaches a critical mass of contamination. And so the only way to purge the land of this metaphysical contaminant is to kill both parties in this sinful act. And so you see this where it's talking about men engaging in intercourse with relatives, with specific in-laws, and you also see it in the prohibition on bestiality, where the animal and the human die. And so it's very clearly not saying both parties are equally guilty of choosing to engage in this sin. It's referencing something else. So Exodus 20:13 is the only place where the receptive partner seems to be condemned, but that condemnation is just part of this formula of both parties have to die. In other words, when we look at Leviticus 18 and 20, if we are trying to very, as clearly as possible, delineate what is being prohibited and why, the biggest problem is the insertive partner in an act of male same-sex intercourse, and it seems to be because it generates a metaphysical contamination that pollutes the land based on the fact that they are violating this social hierarchy of domination and penetration. So when we understand what Leviticus is saying that way, which I think is a more or less accurate representation of where the scholarship stands, and there is some disagreement, but I think I'm representing the consensus view. This is not some idea that God has unilaterally prohibited all homosexual activity, much less homosexuality in general. It is reflecting a specific idea about the harm of these sinful acts, and it is prohibiting it for members of the house of Israel who are in the land of Israel. And even Jewish scholars have said, this does not apply to anyone who is not a member of the house of Israel. This does not apply to anyone who is not residing in the land of Israel. And so Christians who would appeal to these passages from the Hebrew Bible as a means,
America,
as a means of deploying these clobber passages are completely misrepresenting what the text is saying, why it's saying it,
who it's saying
and
it to.
who it's saying it to. Yeah, and so I don't think those passages get the job done for folks who want to use them to try to suggest that God hates homosexuals or that God prohibits unilaterally all homosexual activity. It doesn't do that. It prohibits a specific act for a specific reason that is not relevant to any Christian today in the 21st century.
And as far as the Old Testament goes, you have at least two other problems. Tell me if I'm right. One is, if you're going to interpret the Old Testament to saying that homosexuality is evil, if you're going to take that interpretation, it's like if you have to pick up one side of the stake, you pick up the other. It says the consequence needs to be death penalty. So any modern Christian that's going to take away from the Old Testament that homosexuality is evil, wouldn't they need to take away also the interpretation that God wants all gay people killed?
Well, and that's where we get into the fact that everybody's negotiating with the Bible. And you have lots of different ways that Christians try to figure out a way to maintain the prohibitions they want from the Hebrew Bible without maintaining the punishments that are prescribed.
Because what else is forbidden in the Old Testament?
Oh, all kinds of things. You've got to stone your disobedient son to death. Women can't wear pants. That is an abomination as well. Shellfish. There are
something about menstruating and
I can't have sex with your menstruating wife. That's an abomination. There are all kinds of different things that have been abandoned, and there are all kinds of rationalizations for why it's okay to abandon certain things, but other things we still need to maintain. There are a couple of different ways that is achieved by Christians. One way is this idea that the laws of the Hebrew Bible can be divided into moral, ceremonial, or moral, ceremonial, and civil laws. And only the moral laws remain relevant to Christians, according to that argument. However, the Hebrew Bible never identifies any such divisions of the law. The Hebrew Bible treats them all equally. It's not until the 2nd and 3rd century CE that we begin to see Christians who we've just gotten over the argument about whether or not we're going to keep the Hebrew Bible. Now that we've decided we're going to keep it, we have to figure out what's still relevant and what isn't. And so that's when you begin to see this idea bubble to the surface of, oh, well, let's divide them up into moral and ceremonial laws, and let's get rid of the ceremonial, and then later on you have the addition of a civil division. So that's one way Christians rationalize why some laws are still in force and some are not, although that is not consistently applied. Because if you look at the Ten Commandments, some of those are ceremonial laws, and we still consider those to be in effect. And if you look in the only part of the New Testament that says these are the laws we're going to keep, that's the book of Acts, following the Jerusalem Council. They say, okay, we're going to let the gospel go to all the Gentiles, and there are 4 rules that we all have to keep. And this is basically, here's what we're going to do from the Old Testament. No fornication, no idolatry, no eating meat that has been strangled, or meat that has been offered to other gods. In one place there are 4 of them, in one place there are 3 of them. But those are 2 moral laws and 2 ceremonial laws. So even in the New Testament's own explicit explanation of what we're going to keep, it doesn't follow that division of the laws. And also Paul doesn't care about what other foods you eat. So Paul would say, well, it's only the 2 of them. So we have inconsistent ways of negotiating with the text. And another way is to say any law that Jesus repeated in the New Testament is still in force. But that way you also have problems with the fact that there are a lot of things that Jesus didn't repeat that a lot of Christians consider to be in force. So there are problems with the ways that Christians negotiate what from the Hebrew Bible they consider relevant, but there's none of them would agree that we have to still impose the same well, not none of them. Certainly there are people who would say that, but for the overwhelming majority, the death penalty is not realistic, and so we're already negotiating with it, even if we want to hold on to it.
Okay. So that kind of covers the main passages people cite in the Old Testament, is that right?
In the Hebrew Bible, yeah. Well, no, there's one other, and that's Genesis 19, which is about Sodom and Gomorrah. But that's... The problem there is not homosexuality. The problem there is sexual assault and inhospitality. Basically, you mentioned earlier, if you take the submissive position, you are having power taken from you. And this is what the men of Sodom want to do to the angels that are in Lot's house. They want to sexually assault them as a means of demeaning them, debasing them, robbing them of their power. So that is considered the most heinously inhospitable thing you could do for guests who are not from your area. And that's what the condemnation is about, the inhospitality. And we have a parallel story in Judges 19 where a Levite is traveling, stays over in a town because he knows there are Israelites there, comes into a house, has his concubine, and the men of the city surround the house and demand that he be led out so he can be sexually assaulted. And the story there is more explicitly kind of exposing the inhospitality of these people, and that's what the Levite is ultimately so upset about. But just like Job, the Levite offers the woman he has at his disposal and basically shoves his concubine out the door, and they sexually assault her, which results in her dying later. And so in Genesis 19, Job offers his daughters, and this is a way of saying Lot offers his daughters, and this is a way of saying Lot is so hospitable to strangers that he's willing to sacrifice members of his own family to protect the power, the honor, the social position of his guests. So this is a story about inhospitality. That is how it is referred to in Ezekiel, who actually says the sin of Sodom is an overabundance of bread, prosperous ease, and she did not strengthen the hand of the orphan and the widow, or the oppressed and the downtrodden. All the other passages from the New Testament. So that's everything from the Hebrew Bible that I can recall.
So the sin of sodomy, with a more informed understanding of the Hebrew Bible, is rape or assault or inhospitality.
Yeah.
It's not gay sex.
Correct. And even there are parts of the world still to this day where sodomy sexual assaulting a man is a means of punishment, of demeaning, power. And in fact, I have a friend who mentioned while he was serving in the army that he heard stories about people where if somebody committed a crime in a village, the punishment would be the other person's family would send men over to sexually assault him. And this was not because they were sexually attracted to men. It was because that was a tool of punishment and of taking power. And so that was a way to rectify the situation. And so what's going on in Genesis 19 has nothing to do with homosexuality as a sexual orientation. These men were not trying to sexually assault Lot's guests because they were sexually attracted to men. This is about inhospitality and the use of sexual assault as a heinous example of inhospitality. Then we get into the New Testament, and really there's only one author who has anything at all to say about same-sex intercourse, and that's Paul.
And it's worth saying Jesus said nada, right?
Not a thing.
You'd think if Jesus were the guy, right? If Jesus were the man, the ultimate authority, and he really cared, he would have had something to say about it, right?
But yeah, in Paul we have 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9, which it uses two different terms in Greek, malaki and arsenokite. And malaki basically is kind of a derisive term that means something like softies. It's referring to people who are soft, and this is a pejorative reference to men who take the receptive role in an act of same-sex intercourse. So already we're distinguishing the two roles. There's not just one generic anybody who engages in same-sex intercourse or even anybody who is attracted to members of the same sex. It's men who take one role, and then arsenokite is a neologism that Paul comes up with based on the Greek translation of Leviticus 18 and 20, which means men betters, something like that. And so that would be the one who takes the insertive role. And so we have those two roles are mentioned as people who will not inherit the kingdom of God. And then Paul goes into a tiny bit more detail in Romans 1, where he's describing the depravity of the Greco-Roman world, where he says they're worshiping animals and the works of their own hands. They're worshiping the created rather than the creator. And he suggests that natural theology, or the idea that nature itself testifies of God, therefore anyone who can perceive nature has no excuse for not worshiping God appropriately. Because they have rejected the testimony of nature and have worshiped the works of their own hands and the created over and against the creator, God has given them over to their passions. Basically, the idea is that God has kind of a governor or a restraint on the extent to which passions can bubble up, and these people were not deserving of that, and so God removed that governor or that restraint and allowed passions to run wild. And the result of this, according to Paul in verses 26 and 27, is that the women gave up their natural utility, and this means their usefulness, and the men gave up the usefulness of their women to engage in something that most scholars identify as a euphemism for same-sex intercourse. And so it's not directly saying, hey, this is wrong. It's saying these people are worshiping the wrong thing, and therefore God has allowed them to run wild with their degeneracy, which has resulted in female and male same-sex intercourse. And with Paul, we're still dealing with somebody who is embedded within a specific social and historical set of circumstances. And Paul understands same-sex intercourse to be wrong for more or less the same reasons, but there are some expansions on this. Male same-sex intercourse for a long time was wrong because it was demeaning the men who are at the top of that hierarchy. Female same-sex intercourse was not so easily accommodated into this sexual ethic because they weren't at the top of that hierarchy, and so there wasn't really the same rationalization for why it's wrong. But they were still pretty sure it was wrong because it just didn't seem right. And so there was a term in Greek that they used that basically that was kind of a pejorative term that basically, well, it came from a root that meant to rub. And so they were kind of dismissed as kind of just these weirdos who were pretending to be men. They were false insertive partners. And so they were pathologized in an entirely different way. And what Paul is getting at is that this is all wrong because this goes against nature. And by nature, he's referring to the fact that women seem designed to be the receptive partners of an insertive partner. So at its foundation, the argument here is that this seems to go against nature. Now, we know that's false. We know, one, that same-sex attraction is not the product of degeneracy running wild. It is something that is innate and immutable in the overwhelming majority of the people who experience it. So it is natural. So Paul's notion that it is against nature is also flatly false.
It also exists in the animal kingdom across
also exists in the animal
over
kingdom.
100 species.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So
which by definition is nature, right?
Yeah. So it is not something that is the product of human degeneracy gone wild. It is perfectly natural. And so the framework on which Paul is basing this rejection is false. It is just empirically false. It is not how nature works. And you know, elsewhere Paul says that nature testifies that long hair on men is disgraceful. I am unaware of any such testimony offered by nature anywhere. So what Paul is doing is taking social mores and trying to rationalize them. And I think for this is kind of a difficult one, and so he just takes the lowest hanging fruit. Oh, that's unnatural. Turns out it's not. So just like people today who would say, oh, it's unnatural, it's not unnatural. It's something that's perfectly natural. And so that criticism is wrong.
And by the way, if a Mormon or an evangelical Christian wants to interpret Paul's discussion around same-sex sexuality as a condemnation, then they would have to also apply Paul's concerns about long-haired men to the way that both evangelical Christians and LDS church leaders depict Jesus as a long-haired man, right?
Yeah,
that would be equally problematic. Am I wrong?
Well, if we were going to be consistent with the text, but again, this is a situation where everybody's already negotiating with the text, and even when it comes to Paul's sexual ethic, we're already negotiating away most of what Paul cares about because Paul was celibate. Paul wanted everybody else to be celibate. The allowances that were offered for sexual intercourse had absolutely nothing to do with procreation. So people who say today, well, same-sex intercourse is wrong because it doesn't lead to procreation, totally irrelevant to Paul. Could not have cared less about that. In fact, Paul treats, and this is still debated among scholars, the degree to which this is the case, but Paul treats sex as something that is only appropriate for married couples. And Paul seems to suggest that you should only get married if you can't hack celibacy. And I would argue that within the marriage, sex, because procreation isn't an issue, and because within Paul's worldview, it should not be primarily about pleasure. In Greco-Roman period Judaism, you have a number of folks who are adopting the same philosophical frameworks as Paul, arguing that sex that is engaged in primarily or solely for pleasure is entirely inappropriate. They're arguing it should be for procreation alone. It's okay if you enjoy it, but it can't be because it's enjoyable. It is supposed to be because you're procreating. Paul says Jesus is coming back too soon for procreation to be a concern. So procreation isn't even on the table. And so what is the only other reason you could be having sex? And for Paul, the idea seems to be that to relieve your natural urges. And so if you can't hack celibacy, get married, that becomes your release valve. However, that doesn't mean you just run wild. It's still something that should be, he says, holy and honorable, and not with the passion of desire like the Gentiles who don't know God. In other words, you're not just going nuts. Don't be too happy about this. This is just something that should happen when it is necessary to keep the urges kind of at a minimum. And so Paul's whole sexual ethic is something that we have abandoned long ago. Obviously, Jesus did not come back so quickly. And so today, folks who want to appeal to Paul are appealing to a sexual ethic that is based on the notion that the world was going to be ending too soon to have any kids anyway, and is based on the idea that celibacy is the higher law, and the idea that sex should only be engaged in on those occasions where somebody's passion was bubbling a little too violently. And so there are a lot of people who want to point to Paul and say, that's God's word, God said it. No. This is a man embedded within a specific social and historical circumstance, trying to make sense of the received traditions using the social and historical frameworks at his disposal. And those social and historical frameworks are either empirically false or no longer relevant. And so the argument can't really be made from the Bible at all that God condemns homosexuality or that God condemns same-sex intercourse. Everyone who argues we should not historically contextualize this part of the Bible is going to historically contextualize some other part of the Bible. In other words, nobody is consistent in that regard. Everybody's already negotiating with the text. And so the question for me becomes, why maintain this prohibition? Why ignore all of the context? Why ignore what Paul was really getting at and why, if we're going to do it for other texts? And what I can come up with based on my research in the cognitive science of religion and what's going on here is that opposition to same-sex intercourse has become a central identity marker of certain conservative religious groups. And that identity marker is too important for them to give up. And unfortunately, they wield that identity marker in a way that hurts people and communities and leads to people taking their own lives, leads to people taking other people's lives, leads to all kinds of abuse, all kinds of depression, and all kinds of loss of life. And so I think we need to get over using that identity marker as a lever for structuring power and values in ways that serve our identity politics. And just like it happened with slavery, just like it has somewhat happened with misogyny, this is something that we will abandon at some point in the future. The consensus will be it's time to let this go. And it's just a matter of getting enough people to decide that the lives of these LGBTQ plus people and communities is worth more than the value of homophobia as an identity marker. There are issues in the past that have been presented by leadership as doctrine that can't be questioned and will never change, that have been questioned and have changed. And so I don't see anything in LDS ideology or theology anywhere that indicates that this is not something that can ever possibly change. I hope that it can change.
A faithful Latter-day Saint should reflect deeply on the reality that the Book of Mormon is, in addition to Jesus himself being completely silent on the issue of same-sex sexuality, the Book of Mormon, which we're told is written for our times and is the most correct book, as I understand it, remains 100% silent on the issue of same-sex sexuality.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
And the Doctrine and Covenants, again, as I understand it, 100% silent on the issue of same-sex sexuality. Also the Book of Abraham, also the Book of Moses, and also I don't believe you can find a quote from Joseph Smith that condemns same-sex sexuality. And what you really find is that, like the word of wisdom becomes a commandment in the 20th century as other cultural dynamics start to swell, right? Mm-hmm. You also find that the Mormon Church's anti-LGBTQ rhetoric starts to swell in the 1950s and 1960s in parallel with other Protestant Christian social dynamics.
Yeah.
Almost in parallel, right?
Absolutely.
As if it's not from God.
Well, and I would say I don't think its absence from Restoration Scripture is an indication that it is endorsed by the sources of Restoration Scripture. But I think it is an indication that if this is intended for our day, either that was not considered to be an issue worth addressing in our day, or perhaps this was intended for an earlier day, a day that has long since passed, a day that was more within the scope of the vision of the producers of the text. And so, however way you slice it, I think that observation complicates the notion that this opposition is something that God has demanded or that God will never depart from.